Welcome, everybody. Thanks for all those who are here in person. We also have lots of people in Zoom land as well who are attending remotely, so they are just entering right now. So we'll start in just a moment. I want to welcome you all to the August edition of our evening lecture series. And a big thank you to Darling's Auto Mall for being the corporate sponsor for the lecture series. I hope many of you were able to come last month, which the lecture was our Goldstein lecture, where we had the director of the National Park Service, Chuck Sams, as our speaker. And so I'm Nick Fisichella. I'm the president and CEO with Schoodic Institute at Acadia National Park. The Schoodic Institute's a nonprofit partner of the park and a center for inspiring science, learning, and community for a changing world. And so together with our National Park Service partners, we co-lead this research learning center where we are all located today. And I also want to just acknowledge that we are also located within the vast homeland of the Wabanaki people. I'm really excited for today's presentation by Dr. Bonnie Newsom on indigenizing archaeology. It's, I think, a good example of the great work happening here and really fascinating in and of itself. And an effort of our partnership here in Acadia is to support science for helping to protect Acadia National Park. And one of the key ways we do this is through fellowship programs that bring talented scientists here to Acadia. And a couple of examples of that are our Second Century Stewardship Fellowship Program and also our JERO Acadia Early Career Fellowship Program. And through both of those, we've been able to support 21 fellows over the last 7 years doing science here in Acadia, and both of the fellowships are created and supported through philanthropic support. And so they're great examples of people like you supporting science and supporting Acadia National Park. And an important part of the science collaboration here in Acadia has been recognizing many ways of knowing. And so we know science is a human endeavor. It's one of our ways of understanding the world. But we recognize there's lots of other ways as well, lots of other ways of knowing, including indigenous relations to lands and waters, and also making a living through harvesting of resources from the landscape and the seascape as well. And so all of these are really critical to understanding the changing lands and seas all around us. And somebody who's been really instrumental in bringing these different ways of knowing together is Rebecca Cole-Will, who is the head of science and stewardship in Acadia National Park. And she's been really instrumental in bringing stakeholders, scientists, and others together to address these challenges that go far beyond just the boundaries of Acadia National Park. And so I'm going to hand over the microphone now to Rebecca to share a little bit more and to introduce our speaker.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's really a tremendous pleasure for me to be here tonight and to have the opportunity to introduce my dear colleague, Dr. Bonnie Newsom. I want to start, as Nick did, by saying we're at Schoodic or Escodic, depending on how you pronounce it and which community you're from, but we're on Wabanaki homeland here, so welcome. Here at Acadia and across the National Park System, we work with tribal nations on a government-to-government basis. That relationship is really important and significant to how we do our business. All 423 units of the National Park System are on Indigenous homelands. Most of them are responsible for managing Native American cultural resources. Among those, thousands of are archaeological sites with connections to contemporary Native people. These heritage resources are threatened by climate change, induced impacts, limited resources that we have to document and protect and manage them. And so we really need these strong relationships and collaborations with descendant communities to inform how we manage in a shared space. Here on the coast of Acadia, and you're going to hear from Bonnie about this work tonight, sea level rise and storm impacts are really taking a toll on ancestral Wabanaki sites, many of them with information and history that goes back 5,000 years. What information do we need to steward these cultural places? How do we honestly engage with Wabanaki people for decision making around this really significant sites, places, and history? And Bonnie's work here is really at the forefront of thinking across the nation in terms of how we do this work and to build a model for truly shared engagement. She's work is critical for consultations for us, working with tribal nations to give us information to think about how do we think about protecting places that have been here forever and may not be here forever going forward. So her work is really having a huge impact, not here for us, but also in the Wabanaki nations, where she's really translating and inspiring and building that communication back to the communities so they can make the decisions that we all need for management. Bonnie is the citizen of the Penobscot Nation. She's an assistant professor of anthropology and faculty associate in the Climate Change Institute at the University of Maine. She holds BA and MS degrees from the University of Maine, and her PhD is from the University of Massachusetts Amherst in anthropology. She has served as the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Penobscot Nation, chair of the Repatriation Review Committee for the National Museum of Natural History, a member of the Maine Indian Tribal State Commission, and a trustee for the University of Maine system. And along the way, she's had children. Now she has 2 grandsons, and she's forging this really great work. So please welcome Bonnie. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky. My mic on, everybody can hear me okay? Wonderful. Well, that was very nice, Becky. I appreciate all the good words. And I want to welcome you all tonight, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm going to use a little bit of my Indigenous language. Bonnie Newsom, Naga Banwabskaunil, Nudakit, Naga Nudaki Kamednil. Greetings. My name is Bonnie Newsom. I'm a citizen of the Penobscot Nation, and I'm also an archaeologist and a teacher. And my slides aren't advancing. Let's see here. There we go. I chose to start this presentation with the Wabanaki language in order to set the tone for the talk tonight, because I view the integration of archaeology and indigenous languages as having transformative effects on the discipline of archaeology, not only in how we engage in archaeological practice, but also how we interpret the lives of past peoples through the study of their material culture and cultural spaces. This evening, I'm presenting on an archaeology project that I've been working on with Acadia National Park, Squiddick Institute, Indigenous students, and community partners. And it's a project that attempts to integrate Indigenous perspectives with archaeological inquiry and climate change impacts on heritage spaces. As a Wabanaki archaeologist, I consider it a real privilege to work with the material culture of my ancestors and to connect with them in such an intimate way. Before I discuss our research, I want to start by orienting you to the project both geographically and culturally. This map shows National Park Service lands in Maine. There are 3 primary areas in the region where the National Park Service manages lands and resources. The one in north central Maine is a relatively new national monument called Katahdin Woods and Waters. The one on Maine's eastern border is St. Croix International Historic Site, and the one on Maine's coast is Acadia, and the National Park Service is working very hard to partner with Maine's Indigenous peoples in carrying out their responsibilities to care for these spaces. As you heard Becky say, the park, and Nick as well, the Park Service acknowledges that they're operating within Wabanaki territory. Just for reference, the term Wabanaki refers to people of the dawn or people of first light, because we are the first to see the sunrise on Turtle Island. The indigenous groups in the region use the term collectively to refer to themselves, but each maintains their own sovereignty. So these maps illustrate Wabanaki homeland. There are 4 federally recognized tribes in Maine: the Maliseet, Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot, and each is sovereign. The map on the left shows the traditional territories of the Wabanaki peoples, and the map on the right shows the location of Wabanaki communities today. Each community has a contemporary land base that differs significantly from their traditional territories. And the work I'm involved in with Acadia focuses on the archaeology and cultural heritage of the Wabanaki peoples, and Acadia is within that homeland. The indigenous peoples of the region have at least a 12,000-year history here, and much of the record of that history is encapsulated in subsurface or archaeological spaces, as well as oral narratives and intergenerational memory and petroglyph sites. The image on the left is an artist's rendition of Gluskab. And Gluskab is an indigenous culture hero who's said to be responsible for the creation of people by shooting an arrow into an ash tree from which people emerged. He's also responsible for many of the geologic features we see around Maine. For example, in Penobscot Bay, a quartz vein near Castine is the result of Gluskab killing a moose and throwing the entrails across the bay. Other features, such as the Penobscot River and Mount Kineo, are also connected to Gluskab activities. And so Gluskab helped shape the Maine we see today, and as such, oral narratives like these are a source of information for understanding indigenous peoples' worldviews and lifeways. Another way we can gain insight into indigenous worldviews is through art. In the center is a photo of petroglyphs from Machias Bay, and these are images that past peoples pecked into stone outcrops. They're also a way to convey information. Petroglyph images occur all over the state, and oftentimes you hear that there's no written record for Native peoples prior to European contact. But in reality, these are records that tell stories and histories. In Machias Bay, for example, there are moose petroglyphs on multiple outcrops that illustrate the presence of this animal within past Wabanaki lifeways. And finally, the image on the right is a picture of archaeological excavations at a site that's really near and dear to my heart. I did my PhD dissertation on this site in Eddington, Maine. And places such as this also preserve indigenous past. These are another type of narrative, though, for understanding the lives of people living here before European contact. It's this last form of indigenous history where I focus much of my work, but I acknowledge these other sources of knowledge as important and valid, and I work to integrate them into how I explore the archaeological materials of my ancestors. I approach my research through an indigenous archaeology's framework, which is archaeology with and for indigenous peoples, and it's shaped by indigenous values and agendas. My work with Acadia National Park follows this approach and is an effort to give indigenous peoples a more prominent voice in archaeology and heritage management, because their voices were silenced for so many years as archaeologists assume the right to explore indigenous heritage spaces without consulting with indigenous peoples. When I think about Indigenous knowledge production and reproduction within archaeology, I try to draw from my ancestors' lifeways to help contextualize my thinking. As an archaeologist, I specialize in Indigenous ceramics, and the ceramic manufacturing process serves as a great analogy for thinking about Indigenous knowledge, particularly within the realm of archaeology. So ceramic manufacturing is an additive process, and this differs from stone and bone tool production, which requires the reduction of raw material in order to achieve the desired outcome. So when a pot is made, and Wabanaki people have been making pots here for about 3,000 years, when a pot is made, you start with the basics: good clay from the earth, water, fire, and as the potter proceeds to create her pot, she makes decisions along the ceramic production sequence, and these decisions are situated within her intellectual realm and cultural context. Indigenous potters here in Maine added materials to their clay to improve pot performance and workability, and this is referred to as temper, and you can see some examples here. These materials generally consisted of crushed shell or crushed granite, and in some regions we also see evidence of people adding balsam fir needles to their clay and using that as temper as well. After they blend their chosen materials, they shape and dry their pot. And once dried, the potter's creation is fired and it undergoes a transformation. And it's this transformation that helps the family or the woman use that pot within the context of her own lifeways. It could either be used to serve her family, or be traded or gifted. So I see this as a good analogy for how I think about archaeology and Indigenous knowledge processes, because as Indigenous archaeologists, we start with a basic understanding of our past that is rooted in cultural, historical, and intellectual processes that have shaped us. As we conduct our archaeological study, we add to those basics using what's available to us, to include things like elder teachings, language, stories, histories, archaeology teachings, and through that, teachings of our ancestors. And so we blend all this together, much like the potter does, and process it not only intellectually, but also spiritually and socially. And it's through these processes that we seek to be of service to our communities, much like the pot is to be of service to the community. It's important to point out that the life history of that pot does not end when it breaks or ceases to function. The pot breaks down and has the potential to remain in process within the community. For example, sherds of the pot, the broken pot, could be crushed up and integrated into a new pot as temper, or they could be used as teaching tools for pottery making, saved as an heirloom, kept in memory of someone, or they could be swept into a debris pile, used to fill a divot on the land surface. The point here is that Indigenous peoples were free to engage with that pot for as long as they chose to do so, in whatever way they chose to do so. So colonization has interfered with that, our ability as Indigenous peoples to decide for ourselves how these materials and these associated spaces can continue to serve our communities. Archaeology as a discipline has contributed to this problem by assuming authority over management of our cultural heritage. And this is evident in archaeological practices conducted all over North America and at Acadia. When you think about things like rigid curation practices, confidential reports that aren't shared with communities, a lack of Indigenous community engagement, and all these contribute to alienating Indigenous peoples from their ancestral past. So to complicate the situation further, climate change is having a detrimental impact on Indigenous heritage spaces. Loss and damage is a significant problem that is associated with climate change. And this refers to impacts of climate change that have not been or cannot be avoided through mitigation or adaptation efforts. As archaeologists, this is one area where we play a very active role, in particularly with regard to what's referred to as non-economic loss and damage, which is loss of both material and non-material forms not commonly traded on the market. And so things like our basketry, for example, while we do sell baskets, it's an economic loss and damage when we lose access to ash trees to make them, but it's also a non-economic loss and damage because we lose that cultural practice. Climate change impacts on cultural spaces and practices are as Wildcat notes, these impacts have a detrimental effect on Indigenous peoples, and they are particularly vulnerable to climate change, loss and damage for multiple reasons. For example, Indigenous peoples live in vulnerable environments. They're tied to place long-term and across generations. The lifeways and cultures of Indigenous peoples are often intimately connected to natural resources that are sensitive to climate shifts. And they're also challenged by social, economic, political, and other kinds of marginalization, making it difficult for them to mobilize resources to address climate change impacts or to even influence decision makers. As a result, climate change affects Indigenous communities in disproportionate ways, and we're seeing this in Maine, particularly as related to loss and damage of coastal archaeological sites. For Maine's Indigenous communities, these sites are remnants of a built heritage that help to tell the story of our ancestors and our cultural connections to place. Shell heaps or mounds, sometimes referred to also as middens, are human-generated accumulations of shell, where in the past, people harvesting shellfish would deposit shells at locations along the coast. The image on the left is from the 19th century excavations at a large shell heap on the Damariscotta River in Maine. And the image on the right is also a shell heap on the Damariscotta River, but it's not quite as prominent. These are important repositories for understanding Indigenous heritage and their fragile and cultural and historic spaces. Most Maine shell heaps document roughly the last 3,000 years of Indigenous lifeways. However, a few date to roughly 5,000 years old, and a few even a little bit older than that. Also, post-European contact shell heaps also exist, although they're much less common. In Maine, people constructed shell mounds using softshell clam or oyster shells. Clam is the most common. These deposits can range from less than a meter to multiple meters thick. The term midden has become a catch-all term for these spaces that, by definition, suggest garbaging behavior. And I think this is a misnomer in many cases because we know that shell heaps can be very prominent features on the landscape and may have been intentional landmark constructions. And so in my opinion, to reduce these cultural spaces to a trash dump status really underappreciates the full breadth of their role in Indigenous lifeways. We know that shell heaps are often complex stratigraphically and reflect dynamic cultural spaces in which families and groups activities would change over time and space. It's not uncommon to find shell-free layers within these sites, and this may be evidence of site abandonment or alternate uses of a space over time. And you can see an example here of a shell heap with some very thick deposits on the upper right, and one that has a simple thin shell layer, which may suggest perhaps a short-term use of this space. In Maine, there are roughly 2,000 shell heap sites present on the coast, and they vary in size and settings. On one end of the spectrum, we have the very large oyster shell heaps, which exist on the Damariscotta River. The Grid and Midden, seen here, is one of the largest shell mounds in the Northeast. Other shell heaps, such as the one shown here in Washington County, are not as prominent, and these smaller remnants may be evidence of once larger sites, that most of which are gone now. They could also reflect short-term use. Many, like the ones in the bottom images, are located in exposed areas along the coast, including Acadia National Park, making them particularly vulnerable to both human and natural impacts. Perhaps one of the most notable characteristics of shell heaps is their preservation of varied data sets. Because the shells act as a preservation agent, by reducing the acidity in the soil, these sites contain artifacts and ecofacts not preserved in other types of sites. Some examples of the types of organic materials recovered from shell heaps are shown here. Plant materials, faunal remains, and shell. These can all be radiocarbon dated and can inform our reconstructions of past environments. They can also help us determine what time of year Native families used a particular location, what they relied on for food resources, and they can inform our understandings of past people's ideologies and their relationship to other variety of plant and animal species. Cultural material recovered from shell heaps includes stone tools, pottery and bone tools, and these provide a window really into people's philosophies on materiality. We can examine how the material culture changed through time and space. We can learn about their discard and recycling practices and reflect on maybe how they may differ from our own. Good preservation allows us to explore past technologies and really identify areas of technological sophistication. And this helps to deconstruct notions of primitiveness or evolutionary inferiority, which were common sociocultural interpretations of Indigenous peoples in the past. On this slide, we have some examples of items from Maine sites. You can't have an archaeology talk, I don't think, without showing some arrowheads and projectile points, so had to put those in there. As you can see, they come in a variety of styles and materials. In the center, on the right, we have Indigenous ceramics. And ceramics are a good time marker. They change in time and space, and much like cars or houses change in time, Indigenous ceramics change as well. Because of good organic preservation, we recover items such as these shell beads and this bird bone flute, which was actually recovered from Acadia National Park. And bone and shell do not preserve well on sites on Maine's interior, so we would not have access to these items without shell heaps. Shell heaps also preserve cultural features, and these are remnants of human past activity. But unlike artifacts, you can't pick them up and take them back to the lab to analyze, because you'll destroy them, you'll take them apart. On the left, we have a Fireheart. These are excellent for providing charcoal and remnants of burn materials. On the right is a dark stain indicative of some sort of activity, maybe remnants of a burning or animal processing. So shell heaps can contribute significantly to reconstructions of past environments, food choices, and seasonality. They can help us understand changes in ocean temperatures by the presence or absence of certain species. The image on the upper left is includes shell otoliths, which are the ear bone of a fish, and a swordfish rostrum. There were swordfish in Maine about 5,000 years ago, and we know that because of the archaeological record. The images on the upper right include a copper nugget, possibly from a source in Nova Scotia, and a fish hook. These tell us a bit about past travel and technologies. And the two images on the bottom are cultural features. The one on the left is a standing stone feature. We're unsure of what its function is, but we know that people put it there because it doesn't look like the rest of the matrix. And maybe a marker of some sort. And the image on the lower right has been interpreted as part of a house floor. So shell mound sites are some of the only places where we can acquire data on extinct species such as sea mink and great auk. These three sea mink jaw bones in the bottom left were found clustered together at a site in Machias Bay. And these kinds of discoveries can inform our understanding of the relationships between Wabanaki peoples and various mammals, fish, and bird and reptile species. In addition to being important repositories for scientific and anthropological information, shell heaps carry important heritage and social value as well. Most shell heaps in Maine record indigenous lifeways, and they're important and irreplaceable heritage resources. Although the Maine tribal nations have done really well to maintain distinct cultural characteristics, connectedness to tribal histories and practices was disrupted through efforts of assimilation, disease, acts of violence, and religious conversion during the period of European contact. Also, we no longer have access to the same cultural spaces as our ancestors. Shell heap research and preservation efforts that are consistent with tribal agendas help Indigenous communities maintain culturally distinct practices and identities, and enables us to draw from past lifeways in ways that enrich our communities, educate our young people, and sustain our identities. Research, preservation, and documentation of shell heaps in collaboration with Indigenous communities is one way to confront the effects of colonization on Maine's Indigenous populations. Wabanaki people recognize their connections to shell heaps, and good examples of this can be found in the 19th century writings of Joseph Nicola, who was, among other things, a Penobscot representative to the Maine legislature. And in 1893, Nicola self-published Life and Traditions of the Red Man, a book he wrote to narrate Penobscot traditions for a broad audience. And he drew from his personal knowledges, believing that Indigenous peoples were the only ones qualified to convey information about Indigenous lifeways. Among Nicola's stories are references to shellfish and shell heaps. For example, he shares a story where Glooskap takes a journey across the land, and along the way, he encounters people and animals who guide him in various aspects of life. One such encounter was with May, the woodpecker, and May helps him kill a giant serpent from the ocean. And then, as a mark of friendship, Glooskap dips his arrow into the bloody ocean waters and touches May's head, marking him as a friend forever. After the serpent is killed, May flies away toward the setting sun, but returns frequently to bring Glooskap food. Then one morning, Glooskap wakes to the sound of a dog barking from the direction of the setting sun. Glooskap calls to the animal, and the dog appears with meat in her mouth, which she places at Glooskap's feet. Appreciative of Glooskap's efforts to kill the serpent, the dog says, "I have come to stay with you. I shall stay where and when you stay, and I shall go when and where you go." Eventually, the woodpecker stops bringing food to Glooskap because it was time for Glooskap to find his own food. And this is when the dog steps into her role as companion, and she takes Glooskap to the mudflats near the edge of the water and shows him where and how to get shellfish. So the dog is actually the being that brought shellfish into the lives of the Wabanaki. And on occasion, we see reverence for the dog in the archaeological record, and particularly dogs are sometimes buried ceremonially within the shell mounds themselves. Later in his narratives, Nicola references shell heaps specifically, and in one story he notes that women elders came from the south and were allowed to take oysters so long as their people did not bother the elderly or the sick. This enabled people from both the north and the south to benefit from the oysters. He writes, "These oyster beds were so productive that it gave a supply to all that wish for the period of many times 70 years, so that the shells of this food fish was piled up almost mountain high on the shore of a riverbank for a long distance. So I think this passage is very telling in terms of Indigenous philosophies about food or quote unquote resource sharing. The oysters were not a species to build, to hoard, or to build status and wealth, but something to share. So you can see the shell heaps are embedded in not only Indigenous histories, but they also serve as mnemonic devices for passing Indigenous philosophies and values through intergenerational storytelling. Additionally, shell heaps are remnants of our built heritage in architecture of sorts, similar to post-colonial structures. However, Indigenous histories are generally not well represented in Maine's heritage conversations. Like many Indigenous peoples across the globe, Wabanaki histories and cultural spaces are marginalized and in many cases socially invisible. Preservation, research, and awareness of shell heaps help to counteract the historic erasure of Maine's Indigenous heritage and can also support educational and so the park is working in ways to figure out how to steward these places in both effective and culturally appropriate ways in partnership with the communities. So with all of that as background, I want to turn now to Acadia National Park, which is home to 24 known Indigenous cultural spaces, most of which are coastal shell mounds, again, threatened by climate change, sea level rise, and human impacts. These places range from roughly 4,000 to 500 years old and reflect past lifeways of Indigenous families who left belongings, gifts, creations, art, activity areas, food. My students and I integrate the use of the word family into our work in an effort to humanize Indigenous peoples in the past and to deconstruct some of the sterile or alienating language that's used in archaeology, like occupants or site inhabitants. This practice creates a real different visual for our audiences and exemplifies our view of our relatives living in Acadia over millennia. But since we're trained in conventional archaeological methods, we realize that archaeology has its own language that we have to be cognizant of, and we draw from that language as well. So there are several challenges to shell heap archaeology in Acadia National Park. For example, shell mound research has been intermittent and there's been very limited study of the materials Wabanaki ancestors left behind. This has created a gap in knowledge about Wabanaki peoples, ancestors, and past lifeways, and our connections to Acadia. Additionally, because our current understandings of Indigenous cultural spaces is sparse, park staff members have been ill-equipped to discuss the contents of the Damascotta shell heaps are an anomaly, I would say, within the shell heaps of Maine in general. They're very, very large and they're made of oysters. And the environment at the time that they were constructed was particularly suited for oyster habitation of that area. And that's a major difference, but it's during the same time period that we see other sites, shell heap sites in Maine. So I was talking about how park staff members are ill-equipped to talk about some of these spaces because of the lack of research that has occurred at them. Additionally, from the tribal perspective, European contact disrupted our engagement with these spaces and the past peoples and practices. And because of inhibited access to these places, we don't have the necessary information that we need to advise the park on what might be appropriate stewardship. We know that we know what's there and what activities have taken place there. We need to know these things in order to have meaningful dialogues about stewardship. And so with some support from Second Century Stewardship, as Nick mentioned earlier, we designed a research project to address some of these challenges by using existing or quote unquote old collections as a basis for learning more about pre-colonial Wabanaki relationships with Acadia National Park lands and waters. And our goals with this initial phase of this project is to address gaps in knowledge on past Indigenous occupations or use of Acadia National Park. And we selected archaeological materials and sites from 2 Indigenous cultural spaces in the park. Our second goal was to use this information acquired through this research as a basis for knowledge exchange and communication with Wabanaki communities and other stakeholders. And finally, the third goal of this project was to help in skill building among Wabanaki interns and build capacity within the communities to take the lead on archaeological interpretations and research. At the start of the project, we determined that it needed to include a way for community voices to contribute to our work. This project is not conducted in a vacuum, and I think it's really important to point that out. And it's, you can see all of the partners here. It's grounded in some stable and long-standing relationships that involve multiple advisors, and these relationships have really emerged over time. And this piece was essential for moving the project forward in a good way at the start. I had the good fortune to work with 2 Wabanaki graduate students who did most of the analysis of material remains from the Acadia sites, which I'll talk about in a minute. Isaac St. John from the Holton Band of Maliseet Indians and Natalie Dana Lola, who is Passamaquoddy and Penobscot, both bring their own identities and experiences and insights to the project. It's important to point out that for all of us, we're trained as archaeologists in conventional archaeological practices, and the 3 of us together are working towards kind of a productive symbiosis of different knowledge systems. So we're bringing our own knowledges together with what we've learned, through our academic experiences to understand the lifeways of our ancestors. We selected 2 park locations from which we re-examined archaeological materials recovered from excavations that were conducted in the park in the 1970s and 80s. One is at Fraser Point here on the Schoodic Peninsula, and the other is at Isla Ho. And we selected these sites for several reasons. They both have very robust collections of materials and records to re-examine. They represent one offshore and one mainland site, offering opportunities to understand how Wabanaki people use different types of places. Each site had some archaeological reporting done in the past, and they also represent different site types and periods. And finally, there were some ethnohistoric and historic research that had been done at both of these locations, and we felt that an archaeological study would be a nice complement to that work. These are some images of the cultural materials we're focusing on. For this first phase, we focused on lithics or stone tools and ceramics. It's important to point out here that the material from these places has been locked away for decades since they were excavated in the 1970s, with no active role in Wabanaki society. In fact, the students and I were the first Wabanaki people to engage with these materials since they were excavated in the 1970s. This is some of the Indigenous language that we're putting to use as we think about some of these materials that we're working with. Penobsc is translated to stone, and it's a root word for Penobscot, which is part of our identity. Musalungsquazoti is the term, the Passamaquoddy term for clay pot, and it's actually animate, and that says something about the role of the pot in Wabanaki lifeways. I think these examples show that as we move beyond kind of conventional archaeological language, we can begin to reveal some dynamic relationships between our ancestors and their material culture. We've done analysis of lithic and ceramics at both Idaho and Fraser Point, but for purposes of this lecture, I want to focus specifically on Fraser Point. This site was excavated in the 1970s by Dr. David Sanger and a team of University of Maine students. This is an image on the right of the stratigraphy at this site, and you can see it has a mix of shell and non-shell layers. And the image on the left is, in the center is some erosion that was occurring at Fraser Point at that time, and the erosion has just gotten worse since then. And the far left is a copy of the report that was produced from these early excavations, and you'll note it's marked confidential, and that's so that these places aren't publicly accessed in a way that might do damage to them. Softshell Clam actually comprises the shell deposits here. Notable are the remains of great auk and sea mink, both extinct now, and there's a large bird bone flute, possibly goose here as well. Dr. Sanger proposed two periods of use of this site, one at roughly 2000 BP, that's before present or before 1950, and another at 1000 BP and a little later. There's also an historic homestead at this location, which has been interpreted as the home of Thomas Fraser, who was a freed slave who lived at this location in the late 18th and early 19th century. There's also possible, what we would call in archaeology terms as late archaic use of this site, which is between 4,000 and 5,000 years ago. Dr. Sanger and his students reported on material culture recovered from Fraser Point, and they took measurements and classified projectile points into categories and groups based on stem form. And you can see some of those forms, those projectile point forms on the left. As Indigenous archaeologists, we engage in some of these standardized tasks. The size of a projectile point will not change, and the various attributes of material culture all reflect choices by the maker. And so I think it's important that Wabanaki students understand these practices and apply these practices in their analysis. And so they conducted the similar measurements and attribute analyses as Dr. Sanger did and his students. Similarly, we conducted analysis on ceramics recovered from Fraser. Our analysis was more comprehensive than what was done in the past because as disciplines evolve over time, our analytical techniques become more sophisticated, and archaeology has developed a lot of wonderful techniques for understanding material culture a little better. We know now that there were 23 ceramic vessels created or recovered from this location, and most date to between 2150 and 650 BP. And they include multiple surface designs, and they're made primarily with crushed granite temper, and temper is the additive that potters put in their pots in order to make them workable and fireable and those kinds of things. There's very little use of shell temper at this location. Not sure. There's a lot of understudied questions about when and why people shifted to shell temper in their pots. And this is, you would think that a shell midden, you'd see more of it, but we don't here. Our analysis kind of went beyond these basics. The students used a blended approach that brings together these conventional archaeological techniques and added Indigenous language descriptors and terminology. This is our biface or projectile point analysis form. It's a pretty standard form, but we've added a space here at the bottom for Wabanaki language terms. And these Wabanaki language terms are used by the students to describe what they're seeing in the material culture. And through this process, the students have created lists of Indigenous language descriptors for the materials that they worked with. And this process enables us to get a bit closer to really to the makers as we analyze and interpret our ancestors' belongings using some of this Wabanaki terminology. This also helps us to bring new meaning to our analysis and indigenizes information we convey to others in our communities. And it helps to build awareness, and awareness that we hope will eventually contribute to stewardship conversations about sites in the park. So this research is really in its infancy, I would say, and we've had many opportunities to share our work with others. As a result, we have a couple of spin-off projects that serve to bring the Park Service and cultural sites in Acadia and Wabanaki peoples closer together. For example, the Senator George Mitchell Center for Sustainability Studies at the University of Maine funded a webinar series that we created in order to take the information we have gathered from our work at Acadia and other places and create a webinar for Wabanaki communities. We currently have plans to share that with a broader audience in the future. We were also recently funded to do some deeper exploration of Fraser Point through a national trust telling the full history grant program. And this project is designed to examine additional Indigenous materials from Fraser Point excavations, bringing community representatives, archaeologists with particular specialties, and Indigenous fluent speakers all together in one workshop to help analyze and understand the material culture that has been recovered from Fraser Point. And we hope that this collaborative process will bring new knowledges to the Fraser Point collections that can be shared both with Wabanaki peoples and with the broader public. So where does climate change resilience fit within all of this work? Well, the definition that I use for resilience here is from Wong Parodi and her colleagues, who state that resilience includes the ability to acquire new capabilities, perhaps emerging stronger from the struggle. And Wabanaki people have a long history of doing that. Heritage loss and damage are part of the Wabanaki's climate change struggle, and under current and predicted climate conditions, we cannot protect all of the Wabanaki sites from impacts of climate change. What we're attempting to do with this project is to bring two fragile cultural resources together, Indigenous languages and archaeological heritage, to transform this loss and damage into something that can strengthen the Wabanaki communities in the following ways. They can strengthen cultural identity by connecting present peoples with their ancestral past. This project confronts climate change related heritage loss and transforms it into something that benefits communities. It also deconstructs erased connections to place resulting from colonization efforts that physically and socially distance Indigenous peoples from their heritage spaces. It integrates lessons from our ancestors into contemporary community knowledges, and these lessons may relate to climate change, engagement with non-human relatives, sustainable lifeways, and ceremony. And it also brings an archaeological perspective to archaeological interpretation. Excuse me, a Wabanaki perspective to archaeological interpretation. So to conclude, Indigenous heritage sites in Acadia represent roughly 4,000 years of Wabanaki engagement with past lands and waters. Wabanaki participation in archaeological science demonstrates Indigenous agency in responding to some of these climate change impacts. Indigenous archaeology's frameworks support resilience in climate change impacts on heritage. And finally, it really exemplifies the utility and value of community engaged research, and that can be community engaged research across all the communities that kind of make up our society. So I would like to say Chi Willy Wan, which means great thanks, particularly to our Wabanaki ancestors for sharing their lives with us in this intimate way. I'd also like to thank our Wabanaki contributors who make this work meaningful and really enjoyable. We're all enriched and strengthened by these experiences. And I have to thank our friends who support our work at Acadia and at other places, because without that, we couldn't do this work. So with that, I would like to thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Are you monitoring the Zoom as well, or? Okay. Okay, thanks. Okay, we'll start in the person standing in the blue shirt. Absolutely. Typically, archaeological shell heaps are challenging to excavate, in part because of the stratigraphy. It is oftentimes muddled, but we have to go through these sites with a trowel. You can't simply auger or dig a regular hole. And typically we dig in a standard excavation unit is 1 meter by 1 meter square. And we take that down in probably 5 centimeter levels using a trowel. We collect the materials, we put it in a bucket, we take it to a screen and sift it, looking for any material culture that we may have missed as we're excavating. And then after all is said and done, those materials get put back into those holes, and we cap it with whatever earth we can that's left. So yeah. Anyone else? Yes, sir. You mean having these kinds of sciences? Absolutely. I think, one of the things that I've noticed, sorry. He asked if these experiences in the park create a space for Wabanaki people to be more involved in the park, essentially. Is that correct? Yeah. And feel more welcome. Yes. And I wanted to say that, in fact, the work that we're doing at Fraser has actually brought us together as communities with the Park Service around this space. And Fraser Point has really taken on new meaning, at least for the folks that have been engaged with that. So yes, absolutely. Yes, and the stripes? The question is, what is the Wabanaki population in the state of Maine? So there are 5 communities, about 2,000 or less in each community. So it's not a very big community at all compared to some of the tribal nations in other parts of the country. So it's fairly small. Yes. Yes. So what to do? Well, actually, we have. Sorry, I keep forgetting to repeat the question. The question is, participant in the audience knows of shell heaps on people's property. They're eroding. What to do about them? Well, the University of Maine has established what's referred to as a Midden Minders Initiative, which is a citizen science initiative where groups of volunteers will actually go out and monitor erosion at particular shell heap sites. And while just monitoring the erosion may not seem like a big deal in terms of saving these places, what that does is it allows us to understand which shell heaps are eroding fastest, which ones are most threatened, what kinds of impacts are affecting particular shell heaps. So if anybody is interested in, thinking about a Midden Minders work, I encourage you to go to middenminders.maine.edu and check it out. We've actually just pilot tested an iPhone app that we can that makes it really easy to go out and measure shoreline erosion. So great question. Yes. The question is, what were the signals that may indicate that a shell heap is not a garbage dump? So one of the things we know about shell heaps is that people are often buried in them. Not often, but occasionally you will find human mortuary features in shell heaps, as well as dog burials, house floors, and other kinds of ceremonial types of evidence. And so we think that, by those kinds of indicators suggest to us, or me anyway, that not all of them are refuse deposits. Yes, in the Plaid? So the question is about, the question has to do with the Damariscotta shell heaps, the large one, and how I'm sorry, I lost it. Oh. Right. She has a question about the story that Joseph Nicola narrated that said, different members of the Wabanaki communities, as well as people from the south and the north, were able to access these shell heaps. And so that's an oral narrative, and it's a story that may link to people sharing this kind of space or sharing these resources broadly, rather than kind of thinking about them as part of somebody's territory. And I think you have to think about different worldviews when you're living in kind of hunting and fishing and gathering communities. It's a very different way to think about and look at the world than if you're kind of working in a market system. And so when you think about the the story that Nicola shared, it's one line of evidence to suggest that perhaps these weren't something that were linked to particular groups, but were shared among many. How and when our elders consulted in this work. So we are working currently primarily with the Wabanaki Tribal Historic Preservation Officers. The next phase during our language workshop at Schoodic does start to bring Wabanaki elders into the process more fully, and opens the door for Wabanaki elders. So when we started this project, the hope was for us to go to the communities, but COVID hit. And so we had to pivot and readjust how we did our community outreach. And so part of that was a webinar series that we advertised, but we certainly want to, now that we are able to be more active within the communities, we certainly hope to bring more to the communities rather than bring the communities to here. So is that up? We have one more. One more? Yes, sir. Right now, what we're thinking is let's take a look at the collections that we already have and begin to interpret those more fully. The reports on those are pretty sparse on the work that was done in the 70s and 80s. And I think in terms of doing any more excavations in the park, that's really a decision that has to be made collectively with community partners, our elders, whether or not that's a viable option for going forward. Okay,